Hey everybody, I'm Devin DWYER in Washington. Welcome to the briefing room on this Friday. Two major headlines developing today. Great to have two of ABC's finest reporters with us. Chief Justice Correspondent Pierre Thomas, Chief Transportation Correspondent David Curley. I clearly didn't get the time memo, guys. Going casual Friday here, but you guys are in serious attire for some serious news headlines. Let's start with the shutdown. The president just announcing that after 35 days, we have a deal. Let's listen to the announcement just moments ago in the Rose Garden. He says, effective immediately, he's going to allow funding the government for 3 weeks, but he didn't get what he wanted for the border wall. Here's the president.
I have seen and heard from enough Democrats and Republicans that they are willing to put partisanship aside, I think, and put the security of the American people first. I do believe they're going to do that. They have said they are for complete border security, and they have finally and fully acknowledged that having barriers, fencing, or walls, or whatever you want to call it, will be an important part of the solution.
Important part of the solution perhaps to come, but not in part of this, as part of this deal. The president making a pretty major concession. And before we get into the politics of it, and Terry Moran is at the White House, let's talk about the impact of this. A huge relief for hundreds of thousands of workers, federal employees, but also the contractors. And today of all days, the reason we've got David here is because the air traffic controllers today were sort of in the center of the shutdown storm. Huge numbers of them calling out of two major centers, David, that sort of almost seemed to prompt, perhaps, this sort of critical juncture. The air traffic control system was slowing down.
So I think that this being the second payday that a lot of people were going to miss kind of gave us a sense that we were coming to this. And then I think the air traffic controllers could have been the exclamation point on it, because this morning at two centers, one outside of Washington, D.C. and one at Jacksonville, Florida, a number of controllers called in sick. We know from at the Washington Center, which is actually in Leesburg, Virginia, of the 13 controllers that were supposed to be on shift today, 6 called out.
It's almost half.
Nearly half of them were out. And FAA had been telling us, experts have been telling us all along, that when you have the problem of fewer people to deal with the system, you're not going to justify safety, you're not going to jeopardize safety, so you're going to actually slow the system down. And that's what happened. They had a ground stop at LaGuardia Air Force Base for nearly an hour, and then this has rippled through the entire system. Jacksonville also slow. So these two airspaces were very slow, and you could see the boards. Half the flights were delayed.
Yeah, as we've seen
DCA.
from when there's a bad winter storm, it sort of ripples across the country, delays going everywhere. And this is on top of those TSA workers, long lines, the Coast Guard, of course, working without pay, the IRS furloughs hitting the courts even. And the FBI, Pierre, I was struck this week coming out, the agents saying some of their investigations against some pretty serious perps had to be put on hold because of this.
You saw this across the board. Number one, you had the FBI Agents Association, which represents most of the agents, coming out and saying this is affecting national security. It's affecting our ability to do drug cases, to go after violent offenders. And then today, something extremely unusual. The FBI director posted a video which was intended only for the employees, and he was careful to stay out of the political fray in terms of taking sides. But he said, I'm not a person to get angry. And he's a very low-key guy. He said, but I am as angry as I have ever been in some time. And then the point that he made, it was very personal. He talked about, look, yes, you volunteer, you serve at the FBI because you want to help people, but you didn't sign up basically to not be able to pay your mortgage. You didn't sign up to not be able to pay your car note and to pay the rent. And it was very personal, and you could tell that things were reaching that point where this has gone from a political issue to affecting people to the point where something had to give.
And you got the impression today from talking to officials at the White House that they were starting to get a real sense that the scope of this was growing. In fact, ABC News has a new poll out just this afternoon. Take a look at this. A few weeks ago, we found only 18% of Americans said they felt a serious impact from the shutdown. Right now, that number is up to 22%. So just in a couple of weeks in our polling, we found that. And obviously, as you saw there, the president's approval rating down to 37%. That's close to his lowest mark in our survey since he took office. So some of that political pressure certainly being felt. Let's bring in Terry Moran. He was in the Rose Garden when the president made the announcement. Terry, what are you hearing from officials there about why the president decided to make this decision, and where do we go from here?
Well, the president himself said he now has assurances from Democrats that they'll, in his words, be sincere in border security, negotiating border security, where walls and physical barriers are an important part of the solution. But let's face it, it's the pressure that you just showed. Many Americans are now feeling this shutdown. Many, many more. We are one people feel the pain. We all can relate. Somebody who can't pay their mortgage or their rent or their note on their car, as Pierre was just saying, it was affecting more and more people, and he's getting hammered in the polls. He just couldn't stand the pressure. And so he makes this deal that he could have gotten weeks ago. So after all this 35 days of shutdown, all those workers and their families without paychecks, significant impacts on economic growth, which has been hammered as well, and government operations, the FBI, air traffic control, the Coast Guard. He got nothing. And now he's just called reporters back into where he is meeting with some evangelical pastors, and he watches television religiously, as you know, and he is undoubtedly in a fighting mood. Ann Coulter just called him the biggest wimp in presidential history. That's the kind of thing that got us into this pickle in the first place, because he can't take that pressure either. So he's in a very bad place and undoubtedly very unhappy.
And he didn't leave that Rose Garden, Terry, without trying to reclaim a little bit of that leverage. He did threaten that if at the end of the 3 weeks they aren't able to come to some sort of agreement, perhaps we could be back here again. Take a listen to the president and his parting words.
If we don't get a fair deal from Congress, the government will either shut down on February 15th again, or I will use the powers afforded to me under the laws and the Constitution of the United States to address this emergency. We will have great security. And I want to thank you all very much. Thank you very much.
So the Congress expected today to vote on that measure to reopen the government, triggering all that back pay. The president had already signed that into law, so those workers will get the lump sum, plus those paychecks will start going for the next 3 weeks or so. So that's some good news for them. But as you heard from the president, a 3-week clock. Mark your calendars, as you see on our bar there. February 15th is the new deadline for some action on some sort of a deal. So stay tuned on that front. Meanwhile, this morning, Pierre, some major news in the Mueller investigation now at day 20. Not day 20. We've been going for year 2. We've been going for weeks. That Bob Mueller has been investigating this thing, and another indictment. 34 indictments now of people in this scope. Tell us the bottom line about what this means this morning with Roger Stone being hauled into court.
Okay. 7 federal felonies against Roger Stone, longtime associate, friend of the President of the United States, occasional advisor to the President of the United States. He's basically accused of being an intermediary for WikiLeaks. And who is WikiLeaks? What is WikiLeaks? That's the organization that had those hacked emails from the DNC and from Clinton campaign chairman John Podesta. And the U.S. government, the intelligence community has said those emails were hacked by the Russian government, and somehow they ended up in the hands of WikiLeaks. The case that the government made today is that Roger Stone was trying to get information about what WikiLeaks was going to do next, what bombshell they were going to drop next. And then they began to, he began to communicate with, according to the government, Trump campaign officials who were interested in getting this information. He was directed to get the information, the special counsel alleges. And then after it was all over and it became clear that the House and the Senate were investigating this whole issue of Russian interference, the special counsel claims that Roger Stone attempted to cover his tracks, to act like he really wasn't trying to mine and get this information, that he witness tampered, basically, tried to obstruct the case, and that he lied to Congress.
So Roger Stone is someone that was close to the president, Pierre. He was not a central figure in the campaign officially, but someone who's always been an outside agitator, very loyal to the president, very eccentric figure, very prominent in politics going back to Nixon. But tell us why this matters. Today we learned he was indicted for lying, he was indicted for obstruction, but there's nothing in there about conspiracy, and yet there's a lot of talk today about how significant this is in the grand scheme of things. Give us the bottom line on that.
Well, to be clear to everybody watching, there's no allegation that the president, or Roger Stone for that matter, dealt directly with the Russians. Colluded is the term we would use. There's no allegation in this document as far as that. But what it does do is it makes it clear that by the point that Roger Stone would have been trying to collect this information, the world pretty much knew that WikiLeaks had it, and the world pretty much suspected that they got it somehow from the Russians. So what this lays out at minimum from the special counsel's standpoint is that some people in the Trump campaign were willing to receive this information that may have in fact come from the Russians. Now that does not get you to collusion, but this is another case of someone close to the president having ties to people who were at least trying to gather information that somehow made its way from Russia.
Certainly doesn't look good. It looks like he was making an effort, a willingness to perhaps collude or at the very least seek stolen, compromised information that the Russians had their fingerprints on. He makes it clear he never did. And he also denies all of this. He denies lying to the FBI as well. He's going to fight this to the very end.
And you saw him today come out and say, look, I'm not going to bear false witness against the president of the United States. He basically said, I did nothing wrong. If there were some statements that were not quite accurate to Congress, it was not an intentional thing on his part and not material to what we're talking about here. You had the president's team come out and say this is not about collusion. And Roger Stone is not charged with collusion, and certainly the president nor anybody involved with the president was involved in collusion.
And what a spectacle it was outside that courthouse in Florida. And we should say that Roger Stone arrested very early this morning by the FBI. They made quite a scene. He said 29 agents were there. It was simply quite something. And then we did see later from some aerial pictures the FBI continuing to search his house. We don't know for what. But when Roger Stone emerged from that courthouse after just a very preliminary hearing, he'll be formally arraigned here in D.C. He did speak to cameras. Let's take a little bit of a listen. I think we have some sound of Roger Stone speaking after his indictment today.
I am falsely accused of making false statements during my testimony to the House Intelligence Committee. That is incorrect. Any error I made in my testimony would be both immaterial and without intent. I will plead not guilty to these charges. I will defeat them in court. I believe this is a politically motivated investigation.
And our thanks to Pierre for all your reporting on this. Much more coming up on ABC World News Tonight and World News Prime here on ABC News Live at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. But let's go to the White House. Terry Moran, what is the reaction there to what the president had to say about this today?
Well, you know the reaction because you've heard it before. Press Secretary Sarah Sanders basically saying nothing to see here. She said this is something that has to do solely with that individual, Roger Stone, and not something that affects us here in this building. And President Trump himself, of course, tweeting out his familiar take on all of this. Greatest witch hunt in the history of our country, the president tweeted. No collusion, all caps, exclamation point. And then he goes on to say border security is more important. The question about no collusion at this point is that there are now half a dozen of his very close associates, his former campaign manager, a guy he's known for 30 years who was on his campaign's payroll, and others who have been indicted, pled guilty, or been convicted at trial of lying about Russia or WikiLeaks getting the Russia material. So if they're not colluding, what are they all hiding?
Yeah, that's a big question, Terry. Why are so many of these people that were so close to then candidate Trump, why have they lied to the special counsel if they had nothing to hide? A question that remains an open one. Terry Moran at the White House, thanks so much. Much more from you coming up on World News as well. And just to recap, if you're trying to make sense of the Mueller probe as this now stretches into the 20th month, it has borne fruit. As we said, 34 individual grand jury indictments, 7 guilty pleas, 4 people have served prison time, and one person, the former campaign chairman of Donald Trump, Paul Manafort, has been found guilty at trial. And as Terry was mentioning, there 6 of those people were Trump associates. So much more to come from this as Bob Mueller continues that investigation. Meanwhile, I want to circle back to our top story today. If you are just joining us here in the briefing room, the president has announced that there is a deal now to end the shutdown, 35 days of gridlock here in Washington. Some progress, 3 weeks the government will be funded going forward. Workers getting back to work. We caught up with one of those workers a little bit earlier for her instant reaction to this development. Here's what she had to say.
I'm very happy that the shutdown is over. I'll be even more happier once the bill is actually signed, once the ink is on the paper. But you know, it takes some time to make a paycheck, and so I'm happy to be able to go back to work. That gives us enough time to make at least one paycheck. But as you know, for contractors, we are normally not promised back pay. And so it's kind of like we're starting from scratch. And so, you know, just the challenge of just making sure your basic needs are met. That's the difficulty, you know. And in my particular case, my husband is disabled. He has congestive heart failure. And so he's not able to kind of offset my not getting paid because he doesn't have a steady income. We go to work every day. We work extremely hard. We're passionate about what we do at our jobs. You know, our work is our reputation on the job. And so all we want to do is do our best and serve the American people through our jobs. And hopefully, you know, this discussion around border security can be separated from shutting the government down.
All right, hearing from the real voices of people impacted in this shutdown. 35 days. Our thanks to Janet Weinstein for bringing us that story and to Monique Borte for sharing it with us. Thank you for joining us here in the briefing room on ABC News Live. We'll have all the continuing developments of the shutdown now as it's coming to an end after 35 days. And of course, as the Mueller investigation continues to roll on, download the ABC News app. You can follow us there all day long. We'll be back here Monday afternoon, 3:30 Eastern time in the briefing room. Until then, I'm ABC's Devin Dwyer. Have a great weekend.